The bravest people are rarely the strongest. They are simply the first to say, "You are not alone." On a bright autumn afternoon outside one of Chicago's most respected private schools, luxury vehicles lined the curb as parents arrived to collect their children after classes ended. Business leaders answered phone calls worth millions of dollars. Chauffeurs opened polished car doors. Teachers smiled as students hurried toward waiting families. Everything looked ordinary until a frightened voice shattered the peaceful routine. 11-year-old Ethan Harrington stood frozen near the edge of the playground as 3 older boys slowly surrounded him. They laughed at the expensive backpack hanging from his shoulder and mocked him for always being quiet. Ethan lowered his eyes. He had never cared about his father's wealth. In fact, he often wished fewer people knew who his family was. Being the son of billionaire William Harrington had brought him opportunities most children could only imagine, but it had also left him lonely in ways almost nobody understood. Some classmates wanted to impress him. Others wanted to challenge him. Very few simply wanted to know him. Standing only a short distance away, another child quietly watched the scene unfold. Sophie Collins recognized the look on Ethan's face because she had seen it before. She had watched children stand alone while others looked away, pretending not to notice. She had promised herself long ago that if she ever had the chance to help someone who felt invisible, she would never remain silent. Sophie was only 11 years old. She was the daughter of Laura Collins, the woman who cleaned the Harrington family estate every weekday before sunrise. Most people would never have guessed the 2 children knew each other. Their friendship had never been announced. It had grown naturally through brief conversations after school, shared library books, and quiet moments when neither of them cared about family names or social status. To Sophie, Ethan was simply a kind boy who loved science, history, and asking thoughtful questions. To Ethan, Sophie was the only friend who never treated him differently because of the last name he carried. As the older boys stepped closer, Ethan instinctively moved backward until there was nowhere left to go. Teachers were occupied helping younger students. Parents continued chatting nearby without realizing what was happening. Then, before anyone expected it, Sophie walked forward. Her footsteps were steady. Her hands trembled slightly, but she never stopped moving. She placed herself directly between Ethan and the older boys, stretching both arms outward as though a wall much taller than herself suddenly appeared. Her voice was calm, clear, and far stronger than anyone expected from a little girl. "He is not alone," she said. "If you want to keep bothering someone today, you will have to look me in the eyes first." The playground fell strangely quiet. The older boys exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected fear. They had expected silence. They had never expected courage. At that exact moment, a black luxury sedan slowly turned into the school's pickup lane. William Harrington stepped out, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored navy suit after finishing another demanding day of meetings. He looked toward the playground, searching for his son. Instead, he witnessed a small blonde girl standing fearlessly in front of Ethan while 3 older students hesitated only a few feet away. William stopped walking. He did not call out. He did not rush forward. Something about the little girl's quiet determination held him completely still. In that single unforgettable moment, the billionaire realized he was about to witness an act of courage that would change far more than one ordinary afternoon. Sophie never raised her voice. She never clenched her fists. She simply stood where fear expected empty space. The 3 older boys glanced at one another, uncertain how to respond. They had planned to embarrass Ethan, not argue with a girl who looked at them without anger or hatred. One of them shrugged with an uneasy smile. "This has nothing to do with you," he muttered. Sophie shook her head gently. "It does now," she replied. "No one deserves to go home feeling alone." Her words were simple, yet they carried a quiet confidence that surprised everyone within earshot. Ethan stared at the back of Sophie's shoulder, unable to believe someone had chosen to stand beside him when so many others had simply walked past. He wanted to say something, but gratitude had stolen every word he could think of. Several nearby students had begun watching from a distance. A teacher noticed the gathering crowd and immediately started walking toward them. Before the situation could grow any more uncomfortable, the older boys exchanged embarrassed looks and slowly stepped away. None of them wanted to remain under the attention of teachers and parents. They mumbled a few awkward words before disappearing across the playground, leaving behind nothing but silence and a lesson they had not expected to learn. Sophie finally lowered her arms and turned toward Ethan with the same warm smile she always wore inside the school library. "Are you all right?" she asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "I think so." After a brief pause, he added, "Thank you." Sophie smiled. "Friends do not keep score." Those 4 words settled deeply inside Ethan's heart. Standing several yards away beside the black sedan, William Harrington watched every second without interrupting. His instinct as a father had urged him to rush across the playground the moment he saw his son surrounded. Yet something had stopped him. He had wanted to understand what kind of people his son chose as friends when adults were not watching. The answer now stood before him in the form of a young girl wearing a simple backpack with slightly faded straps, shoes that had clearly been worn for more than one school year, and a smile that carried more courage than many executives he had spent his career leading. William quietly thanked the approaching teacher before assuring her everything had been resolved. He continued watching as Ethan and Sophie walked toward the school entrance together, talking about the science project they had planned to finish later that week as though the frightening moment had already become yesterday's news. There was no sign that Sophie expected praise. No hint that she believed she had done anything extraordinary. To her, helping a friend was simply the right thing to do. William found himself unexpectedly curious. He knew nearly every family connected to the school through business events, charity galas, or community organizations. Yet he could not remember ever meeting Sophie's parents. As students continued leaving campus, he quietly asked the school receptionist if she knew the little blonde girl who had been standing with Ethan. The receptionist smiled immediately. "That is Sophie Collins," she answered. "She is one of the kindest students here. Excellent grades, wonderful manners, always helping other children. Everyone loves her." William nodded thoughtfully. "And her parents?" The receptionist glanced at a student directory before replying. "Her mother is Laura Collins." The name sounded strangely familiar. William searched his memory as Ethan climbed into the waiting sedan. Laura Collins. He had heard that name almost every weekday for years without ever truly noticing it. Then the realization arrived with startling clarity. Laura Collins was the woman who quietly cleaned the Harrington estate every morning before anyone else in the household woke up. William slowly looked back through the school entrance where Sophie was saying goodbye to classmates before walking toward the city bus stop instead of an expensive waiting car. The contrast struck him harder than he expected. His son would ride home in complete comfort. Sophie's mother would finish another long day of work before they returned to a modest apartment across town. Yet when the moment of truth had arrived, it was the maid's daughter who had displayed the greatest courage. As the luxury sedan pulled away from the school, William kept looking through the rear window until Sophie disappeared into the afternoon crowd, unaware that one quiet act of kindness had already begun changing the heart of one of the most powerful men in the city. Sophie's city bus disappeared into the evening traffic while William Harrington remained unusually quiet in the back seat of his own luxury sedan. Ethan noticed immediately. His father was normally answering business calls before they had even left the school parking lot, but today the phone rested untouched beside him. The silence felt different. It was thoughtful rather than distracted. After several minutes, William finally looked toward his son. "How long have you and Sophie been friends?" Ethan smiled softly. "Since the beginning of the school year." William raised an eyebrow. "You never mentioned her." Ethan shrugged. "You never asked?" The simple answer lingered in the quiet cabin. William realized his son was right. He had asked about grades, soccer practice, piano lessons, and upcoming science competitions. He had rarely asked who made Ethan laugh or who stood beside him when adults were not watching. "Tell me about her," William said. Ethan looked out the window as familiar streets passed by. "She is the smartest person I know," he replied. Not because she always has the answers. Because she always asks the best questions. William listened carefully. Ethan continued speaking with genuine admiration. She helps everyone with homework, even when she finishes her own first. She shares her lunch if somebody forgets theirs. Last winter she spent 2 weeks making handmade holiday cards for the janitors because she noticed nobody else thanked them. William felt a quiet sense of surprise growing inside him. None of those actions had been dramatic enough to appear on social media or in school newsletters, yet together they painted a picture of extraordinary character. Does she know who you are? William asked. Ethan smiled awkwardly. She knows you are my dad. I mean, does she know? Ethan gently interrupted him. She knows you are rich. She just does not care. William could not help smiling at the honesty. The sedan turned through the gates of the Harrington estate, where carefully trimmed gardens, elegant fountains, and towering oak trees surrounded one of the most beautiful homes in the city. As the front doors opened, several household employees quietly continued their evening responsibilities. William stepped inside and instinctively glanced toward the polished grand staircase before his eyes settled on the freshly arranged flowers in the entrance hall. Everything looked perfect, just as it always did. Yet for the first time in years, he found himself wondering about the people whose quiet work made perfection seem effortless. Has Laura already gone home? He asked the house manager. Not yet, sir, came the reply. She is finishing the West Library. William walked through the long hallway until he reached the library overlooking the gardens. There, Laura Collins carefully dusted rows of antique books while soft, golden light streamed through the tall windows. She looked up with polite surprise. Good evening, Mr. Harrington. William had seen Laura hundreds of times over the years. She always greeted him warmly, worked diligently, and quietly disappeared before drawing attention to herself. Until that afternoon, he had never wondered what her life looked like beyond these walls. Laura, he said kindly, how is your daughter? She smiled immediately. Sophie is doing well, thank you. Pride brightened her face in a way William had never noticed before. She loves school more every day. William hesitated before asking another question. Did she ever tell you she and Ethan are friends? Laura laughed softly. Almost every evening. William looked genuinely surprised. She never mentioned it to me, he admitted. Laura carefully placed the feather duster on a nearby table. Children usually see one another before they see money, she said gently. Sometimes adults need a little longer. Her words carried no criticism. They were spoken with simple kindness. Yet they reached William more deeply than any business lecture he had ever heard. As Laura gathered her cleaning supplies to leave for the evening, William stood alone in the quiet library surrounded by shelves filled with priceless first editions collected over decades. For the first time, none of those treasures seemed as valuable as the lesson a housekeeper had shared in a single sentence. Outside the window, the last light of the setting sun reflected across the gardens, while somewhere across the city, a little girl who had expected nothing in return for her kindness was finishing homework at a small kitchen table, completely unaware that the lives of everyone inside the Harrington household had already begun to change because she chose compassion over fear. The following Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies stretching across Chicago, and for the first time in many years, William Harrington canceled every business meeting on his calendar. His executive assistant could hardly believe it. Investors could wait. Board members could wait. Contracts could wait. There was something far more important occupying the billionaire's thoughts. During breakfast, Ethan looked up from his bowl of cereal as his father folded the newspaper without reading a single page. Are you going to the office today? Ethan asked. William smiled faintly. Not today. Ethan looked surprised. Then where are we going? William reached for his coffee before answering. I think it is time I learned more about the people who have quietly been part of our lives for years. Ethan immediately understood who his father meant. A hopeful smile spread across his face, though he tried not to appear too excited. At nearly the same moment, across the city, Laura Collins and Sophie were enjoying a much simpler morning inside their modest apartment. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window onto a small wooden table where pancakes rested beside fresh fruit and a stack of library books. Laura laughed as Sophie enthusiastically explained a science experiment she wanted to build from recycled materials. Their apartment was not large, but it was filled with warmth. Family photographs decorated the walls. Potted plants rested on the windowsill. Every corner reflected care instead of luxury. Laura believed happiness came from gratitude rather than possessions, and Sophie had quietly adopted the same philosophy. Before leaving for work each day, Laura often reminded her daughter of one simple lesson. Always leave people feeling better than you found them. Sophie carried those words with her everywhere she went. Back at the Harrington estate, William found himself walking through rooms he had crossed thousands of times without truly seeing them. The polished hardwood floors, spotless windows, perfectly arranged books, and fresh flowers had always appeared almost magically. Now he understood they existed because dedicated people quietly cared for every detail, while asking for very little in return. He stopped beside a family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Success had filled the frame with beautiful smiles, but he suddenly wondered how many acts of quiet kindness had helped make that success possible. Later that afternoon, William asked the estate manager for Laura's employment file. He was not interested in salaries or schedules. Instead, he wanted to know her story. The file revealed that Laura had worked for the Harrington family for almost 8 years. She had never been late. She had never received a complaint. She had quietly declined several offers of financial assistance after explaining that she wished to earn every opportunity through honest work. Attached to the file was a brief note written years earlier by another supervisor. It read, "Exceptionally dependable. Always speaks of her daughter with pride." William slowly closed the folder. 8 years. 8 years of passing each other in hallways with little more than polite greetings. 8 years without asking a single meaningful question about the woman helping care for his home. That realization weighed heavily on him. Ethan entered the study carrying a library book Sophie had recommended weeks earlier. "She says this author is amazing," he said. William accepted the book and smiled. "Your friend seems to have excellent judgment." Ethan hesitated before asking the question that had been on his mind since the playground. "Dad, are you upset that Sophie stood in front of me?" William looked directly at his son. "No," he answered without hesitation. "I am grateful beyond words." He paused before adding quietly, "The part that troubles me is that I needed a child to remind me what real courage looks like." Ethan smiled, relieved. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon breeze gently moved through the trees surrounding the estate. William looked toward the long driveway where Laura would arrive for work again on Monday morning, just as she always had. But Monday would not be like every other day. This time, he would not simply walk past her with a polite nod. This time, he intended to begin a conversation that neither of them would ever forget. Monday morning arrived with a cool breeze drifting through the gardens of the Harrington estate as Laura Collins stepped quietly through the front entrance carrying her familiar cleaning supplies. Like every other workday, she arrived 15 minutes early. She believed respect for other people's time was one of the simplest ways to show gratitude. She smiled politely to the security staff, greeted the kitchen employees by name, and immediately began preparing for another ordinary morning. She had no idea this day would become one of the most unforgettable days of her life. William Harrington was already awake, standing beside the large windows of his study instead of leaving early for downtown meetings as he usually did. He watched Laura move through the hallway with the same calm professionalism he had witnessed for years but had never truly appreciated. Every polished surface, every carefully arranged room, every detail that made the house feel welcoming existed because someone like Laura quietly invested her time and care before anyone else noticed. William realized that excellence often lived behind the scenes rather than under bright lights. When Laura finished dusting the library shelves, she was surprised to hear a gentle knock on the open door. Turning around, she found William standing there with a warm expression that immediately made her wonder whether something was wrong. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," she said respectfully. "Good morning, Laura," William replied. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" She looked slightly confused but nodded. Of course. William invited her to sit in one of the comfortable chairs overlooking the gardens. Laura hesitated for a moment. She had never sat inside the study before. It had always felt like a place reserved for important business conversations, not for someone who cleaned the house. Sensing her uncertainty, William smiled kindly. Please. Today I would like us to speak as two parents. Laura slowly took a seat while William poured 2 cups of coffee. For a few quiet moments neither of them spoke. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, illuminating shelves filled with books collected over decades. Finally William broke the silence. I saw what Sophie did for Ethan after school last Friday. Laura's eyes widened in surprise. She told me a little about it, she answered carefully. I hope she had not caused any trouble. William gently shook his head. She prevented trouble. His voice carried sincere admiration. She showed more courage than many adults I have known. Laura lowered her eyes with quiet humility. She simply did what I have always hoped she would do, she said softly. Stand beside people who need someone. William leaned forward. Where did she learn that? Laura smiled as memories filled her heart. Life taught us that kindness is often the only thing people can afford to give freely. When Sophie was very young, my father used to tell her that strength is measured by who you protect, not by who fears you. She never forgot those words. William listened without interruption. Every sentence revealed another part of a family story he had never taken time to understand. He remembered the employment file describing Laura's dedication, but those papers had never explained the values that guided her every decision. Laura, he said after a thoughtful pause, I owe both you and your daughter my gratitude. She smiled politely. There is no need, sir. Sophie helped her friend. That is all. William slowly shook his head again. No. That is not all. She reminded my son that he was not alone. She reminded me that character is far more valuable than status. And she reminded me that I have overlooked extraordinary people inside my own home. Laura's eyes became misty, not because of praise, but because she recognized genuine sincerity. Before either of them could say another word, a familiar voice echoed from the hallway. Ethan had just returned from the school bus after forgetting his science notebook, and beside him stood Sophie, who had insisted on walking with her friend to make sure he found it before classes began. Neither child expected to find their parents already sitting together, smiling as though something wonderful had quietly begun before the day had even started. The unexpected meeting in the study lasted only a few seconds. Before everyone began smiling, Ethan held his science notebook against his chest while Sophie stood politely beside him, suddenly realizing she had walked into a conversation she had never imagined. Laura immediately stood from her chair. Sophie, I thought you had already gone to school, she said gently. Sophie nodded. Ethan forgot his notebook, so I walked back with him. William looked at both children before smiling warmly. I am very glad you did. Sophie seemed slightly confused by the unusual kindness in his voice. She had always known Mr. Harrington as a respectful but busy man whose days revolved around meetings, travel, and responsibilities far beyond the estate. Seeing him standing quietly with genuine gratitude in his eyes felt entirely different. William walked toward the children and knelt until he was at eye level with Sophie. There is something I have wanted to tell you since Friday, he said. Sophie looked down modestly. Sir? William spoke slowly, making certain every word came directly from his heart. Thank you for standing beside my son when he needed someone. I watched everything that happened. Sophie's cheeks became slightly pink. I only helped my friend, she answered softly. Anyone should do that. William smiled. The world would be a much better place if everyone believed that. Ethan looked proudly at Sophie before adding, I told Dad that you always help people. Sophie laughed quietly. That is because people help me too. Laura listened silently, recognizing that her daughter was speaking exactly as she had been raised. Gratitude had always been stronger than pride inside their home. William stood and walked toward the large windows overlooking the gardens. For a brief moment he watched gardeners carefully tending flowers while house staff quietly carried out their morning routines. Then he turned back toward the room. "I have spent years building successful companies," he said thoughtfully. "I have hired brilliant executives and talented professionals. Yet one little girl reminded me in a single afternoon that the greatest measure of a person is not intelligence or wealth. It is the willingness to protect someone else." Without expecting anything in return, silence filled the study. Nobody hurried to answer because the truth in those words needed no response. William then looked at Laura. "You have given your daughter something no amount of money can purchase. You taught her character." Laura lowered her eyes humbly. "I only tried to teach her the lessons my parents gave me." William smiled. "Then their legacy continues through her." After a thoughtful pause, he walked toward his desk and pressed a button connected to the estate's internal phone system. His executive assistant answered immediately. "Please postpone my morning meetings," William said calmly. "I would also like the boardroom prepared this afternoon." The assistant sounded surprised. "Will there be a corporate meeting, sir?" William glanced toward Sophie and Ethan before replying. "Yes. But this one is about people, not business." Laura looked puzzled. "Mr. Harrington, you do not have to do anything because of what happened." William gently shook his head. "I am not doing this because I have to. I am doing it because it is the right thing to do." Sophie stepped forward with innocent curiosity. "What is going to happen?" William smiled kindly. "Today I want everyone in my company to hear a story about courage. Not the kind that appears in newspapers or earns trophies. The kind that quietly changes another person's life." Ethan's eyes widened with excitement, while Sophie immediately looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Sir," she said gently, "I do not think I did anything special." William's expression became warm with admiration. "That is exactly why your story deserves to be told." Outside the study, the morning sun continued filling the Harrington estate with golden light, while inside those quiet walls 4 ordinary people stood together, unaware that before the day ended, a simple act of kindness performed by an 11-year-old girl would inspire an entire company to rethink what true success, leadership, and human dignity really meant. That afternoon, the executive boardroom on the top floor of Harrington Global looked different than it ever had before. The polished walnut table was surrounded by senior executives, department directors, and longtime managers who had expected another meeting about quarterly growth or international investments. Instead, they found William Harrington standing quietly near the floor-to-ceiling windows with Ethan beside him. The room became completely silent when the doors opened once more and Laura Collins entered, accompanied by Sophie. Both of them hesitated near the entrance. Laura had spent years cleaning conference rooms like this after everyone had gone home, but she had never been invited to sit at the table. Sophie held her mother's hand gently, unsure why so many important people were looking at them. William smiled warmly and walked toward them. "Please," he said, gesturing toward 2 empty chairs placed beside his own. "These seats have been waiting for you." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Several executives exchanged puzzled glances, but none questioned their chairman. Laura quietly whispered, "Mr. Harrington, I do not think we belong here." William answered with calm sincerity, "Today, you belong here more than anyone else." They slowly took their seats while the room remained respectfully quiet. William looked around the table before beginning to speak. "Most of you know me as the man who built this company. Today I want to tell you about the people who reminded me why it exists." Every eye remained fixed upon him. William described what he had witnessed outside Ethan's school only a few days earlier. He did not exaggerate. He simply recounted how one little girl had stepped forward when others hesitated, how she had chosen compassion over fear, and how she had expected absolutely nothing in return. As he spoke, the room gradually shifted from curiosity to quiet reflection. Many executives glanced toward Sophie, who sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking slightly embarrassed by the attention. William continued, "Some of you have spent years discussing leadership inside this room. We have attended seminars, read books, hired consultants, and developed corporate values. Then an 11-year-old child demonstrated genuine leadership in less than 1 minute. No one interrupted him. The truth carried enough weight on its own. William then turned toward Laura. For 8 years you have helped care for my family's home. You arrived early. You worked with excellence. You treated everyone with respect. Yet I never took the time to understand the values you were quietly passing to your daughter. That was my failure, not yours. Laura shook her head gently. Sir, there is no failure. I have simply been grateful to work here. William smiled. That humility is exactly why I wanted everyone to meet you. He then faced the executives again. Success should never blind us to the people who make that success possible. The room remained completely silent until the company's chief financial officer slowly stood from his chair. Mr. Harrington, he said sincerely, may I say something? William nodded. The executive looked toward Laura and Sophie. I have worked beside William for nearly 20 years. Today may be the most important meeting this company has ever held. One by one, other executives quietly applauded. The applause grew steadily until every person in the room had risen to their feet. Sophie looked around in complete surprise. She tugged gently on her mother's sleeve and whispered, Mom, why are they clapping? Laura smiled through tears she could no longer hide. Because sometimes, she answered softly, people finally recognize what has always been there. William waited until the applause settled before walking back to the front of the room. This company measures performance in many ways, he said. Beginning today, we will also measure how we treat one another. Character will no longer be something we admire from a distance. It will become part of how we lead. As warm afternoon sunlight filled the boardroom with a golden glow, everyone present understood they were witnessing far more than a recognition ceremony. They were watching the beginning of a cultural change inspired not by wealth, influence, or authority, but by the quiet courage of a little girl who believed no friend should ever have to stand alone. The days that followed quietly transformed Harrington Global in ways no strategic plan had ever predicted. Employees noticed small changes at first. William Harrington no longer hurried past housekeeping staff with only a polite nod. He stopped to ask about their families. He learned names he should have known years earlier. Department managers began joining maintenance teams for lunch. Executives visited employee break rooms simply to listen instead of speak. Nobody had been ordered to change. They changed because they had witnessed their chairman doing it first. Word about the remarkable boardroom meeting spread naturally throughout the company. Every version of the story ended the same way. An 11-year-old girl had reminded an entire organization that dignity belonged to everyone, regardless of position or paycheck. Meanwhile, life continued much as it always had for Laura and Sophie. Laura still arrived early every morning, believing that consistency mattered more than recognition. Sophie still rode the city bus to school carrying the same backpack and borrowing books from the public library every week. Neither of them sought attention. They simply continued living according to the values that had guided them long before anyone applauded. One Friday afternoon, William invited Laura to his office once again. This time, the atmosphere felt lighter. Sunlight filled the spacious room as the Chicago skyline stretched beyond the windows. Laura entered politely, expecting another conversation about work schedules or household matters. Instead, William greeted her with a folder resting neatly on his desk. Laura, he said warmly, there is something I would like you to read. She opened the folder carefully. Inside was an official document establishing the Collins Family Education Fund. Laura looked up in confusion. William smiled gently. This fund will cover Sophie's education through college, along with books, academic programs, and any opportunity she chooses to pursue. It is not charity. It is an investment in someone whose character has already improved countless lives. Laura's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. She slowly closed the folder before speaking. Mr. Harrington, I do not know how to thank you. William quietly shook his head. You already have. You raised a daughter who reminded my son what friendship means and reminded me what leadership should look like." Laura hesitated before asking the question weighing on her heart. "May I tell Sophie?" William smiled. "I hope you do." That evening, inside their small apartment, Sophie sat at the kitchen table finishing a history assignment, while Laura prepared dinner. The apartment looked exactly as it always had, warm, simple, and welcoming. After setting 2 plates on the table, Laura handed Sophie the folder without saying a word. Sophie carefully read every page before looking back at her mother in complete disbelief. "Mom, this cannot be real." Laura nodded with tears of gratitude. "It is real." Sophie looked down quietly. After several moments, she whispered, "I only wanted Ethan to know he had a friend." Laura gently held her daughter's hand. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness grow into blessings far bigger than we could ever imagine. The following Monday, William visited Ethan's school for a student assembly celebrating acts of kindness and community leadership. Teachers expected a generous donation or an inspiring speech from one of the city's most successful businessmen. Instead, William walked onto the stage carrying nothing except a handwritten note. He spoke about courage, friendship, and choosing compassion before comfort. Then he invited Sophie to stand beside him. The entire auditorium rose to its feet in heartfelt applause. Sophie looked embarrassed by the attention, but William simply smiled with quiet pride. "Today," he told the students, "I am not introducing you to a hero because she defeated someone. I am introducing you to a hero because she refused to let another person stand alone." The applause echoed through the auditorium long after he finished speaking, while Ethan smiled from the front row knowing the world had finally recognized the same remarkable friend he had quietly admired from the very beginning. At that moment, every student present understood that true greatness is never measured by how loudly a person speaks, but by how faithfully they choose kindness when nobody expects anything in return. 2 years passed more quickly than anyone expected, yet the lesson that began outside a quiet school playground continued to shape countless lives. Harrington Global remained one of the most successful companies in the country, but employees often said its greatest achievement could not be measured on financial reports. Visitors entering the headquarters noticed something different almost immediately. Executives greeted receptionists by name. Department directors paused to thank maintenance staff before beginning meetings. Housekeeping employees were invited to company celebrations instead of quietly working after everyone else had gone home. Respect had become part of the culture rather than a slogan displayed on office walls. William Harrington often walked through the building without announcing his arrival. Instead of searching for problems, he searched for conversations. He listened more carefully than he spoke. The chairman who had once believed leadership came from authority now understood that leadership begins by recognizing the dignity already present in every person. Whenever new managers joined the company, William personally shared one story during orientation. He never mentioned stock prices or business victories. He spoke about an 11-year-old girl who stood beside a frightened friend when nobody expected her to. He reminded every leader that the smallest decision made with kindness can influence generations. Across the city, Sophie Collins had grown into a confident young student whose love of learning never faded. The Collins Family Education Fund had opened doors that once seemed impossible, but it had never changed who she was. She still volunteered at the public library every weekend, helping younger children discover the joy of reading. She still believed that listening carefully was often more important than speaking loudly. Ethan remained her closest friend, and together they organized student projects encouraging classmates to welcome children who felt lonely or left out. Neither of them considered those efforts extraordinary. They simply remembered how one moment of courage had changed both of their lives forever. Laura Collins also discovered that respect can become its own reward. Although her responsibilities at the Harrington estate gradually evolved into mentoring new household employees and helping strengthen the family's charitable outreach, she remained the same humble woman who arrived early every morning with gratitude in her heart. She often smiled whenever people congratulated her for raising such an extraordinary daughter. "Character grows one ordinary day at a time," she would quietly reply. One bright spring afternoon, the Harrington Foundation hosted its annual scholarship ceremony inside a beautiful community auditorium. Dozens of students from hardworking families received opportunities to pursue their dreams without fear that financial hardship would stand in their way. William invited Sophie to stand beside him as they welcomed the newest scholarship recipients. Looking across the audience filled with hopeful young faces, William paused before speaking. "Years ago," he said gently, "I believed success was something people built for themselves. Then one brave child taught me that the greatest success is helping someone else stand when they are afraid." The audience responded with warm applause, but Sophie simply smiled modestly, just as she had on the day everything began. She knew the applause did not belong to her alone. It belonged to every parent who taught kindness around the kitchen table, every child who chose compassion over comfort, and every ordinary person who quietly made the world a little better without expecting recognition. As golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the auditorium windows, William looked toward Laura, Ethan, and Sophie sitting together, laughing like family. In that peaceful moment, he realized the greatest gift he had ever received was not loyalty, gratitude, or admiration. It was the opportunity to become a better father, a better leader, and a better human being because one little girl refused to let another child stand alone. Some people change the world through extraordinary power. Others change it through extraordinary kindness. And in the end, history rarely remembers the richest person in the room as clearly as it remembers the one who chose compassion when it mattered most.